Hey, today we are going to code this beautiful material design repo effect. As you can see, when I click on this button, you can see this beautiful wave forming, and then if I click on the button below, then nothing happens. So this is what we're going to code today using no libraries, just native HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Let's go. First, I am starting a new code pen from scratch. I am putting the link to this code pen in the video description, so if you want to go check out the source code, play with it, make some changes, you are free to do it. Let's start with the HTML. I want the HTML to be extremely declarative. What do I mean by that? I mean that the button with repo effect, it's just going to be a regular button tag with an attribute called repo. Just that. And then a button that doesn't have the repo effect should just be a regular button without the repo attribute. So button with no repo effect. It's just that. The HTML is going to be extremely declarative. It's just going to be those two lines. And for that reason, I am going to collapse the HTML because our focus throughout this video will be mostly on the CSS and the JavaScript. Let me save this. First things first, I always use CSS reset. So this allows me to not have to deal with the differences between browsers, so I just reset all browsers to a default state. Also, I do have a bunch of supportive styles, so I'm just gonna copy that from another tab that I have here and paste it here. So every single style here is commented out because I want to explain what each line of code is doing, even though this is not the main focus of this video. This here is only gonna do like basic styles. This is not important for the repo effect, but I think it's important for me to explain every single line in case anyone has questions. So the first line, background, this particular hex color, this is basically just going to change the background color of the page itself to this cool shade of dark blue. Like there's a bit of blue here, I think. The second one, margin 0, this is just to reset the margin from the body. Since I'm using CSS reset, I actually don't think I need this, so I'm going to remove it. Then we have padding 32 pixels. This is just going to give 32 pixels of padding to all directions of the body elements, so top, bottom, right, and left. Then I want to centralize the elements, so I'm going to use display flex direction column, and justify content center. But as you can see, the elements are not vertically aligned yet. But the thing is, they actually are. It's just that the body doesn't have the entire viewport height yet. The body only has this amount of space. So the elements are vertically aligned, but the body isn't taking up all the space available. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that the body should have a minimum height of 100 viewport height. Now they are vertically aligned too. But now we have a scroll bar. And the reason for this is because by default, when you set the width and the height of an element, it is using the content box model. What that means is that the height that you're setting is going to be the height of the content. This is not accounting for padding and border. So basically, I'm saying that the body should have a minimum height of 100 viewport height, which is 100% of what you can see from the window. But I am also giving it 32 pixels of padding. And what this is doing is it's creating a body element that has 100% viewport height, but also adding 32 pixels on the bottom and 32 pixels on top. So this creates this scroll bar here. What we can do to fix that is to say that the box sizing model for this element should be border box. What this does is when I set the minimum height, your browser is already going to understand that this height should be the sum of the content and the padding and the border. So now we don't have a scroll bar anymore. I also want 32 pixels of spacing between each element, so I'm using gap 32 pixels here. Other than that, I also have some supportive styles for the bottom. As you can see, by default, the bottoms come with this border here, this gray border, which I don't want in this case, so I'm just going to remove that. I also want a bit of vertical and horizontal padding. I want them to have a minimum height of 48 pixels. This is just so that they are big enough for basketball players with really big hands. They can just tap on the button and not miss it. It doesn't need to be that value. There's actually a specific value that your buttons should be minimally that height so that your users don't have problems trying to tap on the button and actually tapping on something else. But I don't recall the exact value by head. If you want to research that, I recommend looking into the Norman Neiman group because they outline a lot of guidelines for user experience on the web. Again, I'm also going to use box sizing border box. I already explained what that does. I'm going to use border radius 4 pixels so that we have some nice rounded edges. A particular blue color for the background of the button. The text should be white. When I hover over the button, as you can see, it's only using the default cursor, which is this arrow, but I don't want that. I want that cursor that actually looks like the element is clickable, you know, that little hand. So I'm going to use cursor pointer, and this is going to give me exactly that. So now when I hover over the element, can you see it? Now there is a hand for my cursor instead of the normal arrow, which is exactly what I wanted. Also, by default, the text size, the font size of buttons is, I think, 14 pixels. So I want a little bit more than that. I want 1 rem, which normally is equal to 16 pixels. So I'm going to set font size to 1 rem. And you can see that that increased a bit the font size. I also want the font family to be a sans serif font, so don't worry about all the different options that I'm putting here. The idea here is just I want to use a cool sans serif font, so by starter I'm going to try to use Apple System. If not, then Blink Mac System font. If not, Segoe UI, so on, so on. If none of those fonts are available, then I want to use the default sans serif font that the browser gives us. Also, I want the font weight to be bold. And I also want to make sure that things are vertically centered. So I'm going to use the same trick that I used on the body. Setting display to flex and align items and justify content to center. And lastly, I want a nice box shadow so that it gives a sense of depth to the button. And that's just that. We are now done with the supportive style, so now we can actually get to the main content of this video, which is how to code the material design ripple effect in our buttons. Before we start coding the material design ripple effect, let's deeply understand it conceptually. If you stop to think about it, the material design ripple effect is nothing but a small dot that has some transparency, but not much, is much more opaque than transparent. And this dot grows into a really big circle and becomes fully transparent. So imagine that you have a lot of water centralized in a single spot. You won't be able to clearly see what's on the other side of it, what's in the bottom. It's like when you go into a river, in the beginning you might be able to see your feet, but as you go deeper into the river, then you can't see your feet anymore because there's too much water and generally not complete pure water. So it's kind of dirty and you can't see your feet. Anyways, that's another problem. But that's the whole idea that we're trying to simulate here. Imagine that you have a bunch of water and this water is completely contained into a single spot, into a single pixel on the screen. So there's a lot of water there. There's not too much transparency. And then this small dot of water is going to spill overall into all directions like an actual wave form. And as the water flows into all directions, it becomes less dense, it becomes more shallow, so you have more transparency until it gets to a point where it becomes completely transparent and then it kind of dries up, I guess. So this is exactly what we're going to do. When we click on the button, we will use JavaScript to get the precise location where the user clicked, and then in that point we are going to dynamically create an element which will start by being just very small dot, like just 1 pixel of height and 1 pixel of width. And then we're gonna do a transition that increases this element into a really big circle until it becomes completely transparent. And when it does become completely transparent, for performance reasons, we're going to delete this element from the DOM so that we don't have memory leaks and keep a lot of elements that are just transparent and not needed anymore. Now that you got the idea, let's actually code this thing. First, let's do that by hand. So imagine that inside the button, we will have a div. This div, of course, is not going to be statically created like I'm doing here. It's going to be dynamically created. But this div, let's say that it's going to have a class called repo. So this is going to be our repo wave. Now let's style that. So repo effect styles. All right. So let's get the element with the class repo. And at first, let's just say that the background of it should be white, that they should have 1 pixel of width and 1 pixel of height. As you can see, we already have this very, very small square here, but it's a square. So let's turn that into a circle by using border radius 100%. So now you can see it's a very, very small circle. Maybe you can't even see it properly if you're on mobile. But we're going to increase that, don't worry. So just for us to be able to see it properly, let me use transform and scale and increase the scale by 20. Great, now we can see it. Now it should have some opacity, like we don't want it to be completely opaque. It should have some opacity, but more transparent than opaque. You may want to change those values if you don't like the values that I would choose, but I believe that 40% opacity is enough for the effect that we want. So I think it's good if it starts like this. And then we're going to also add other styles when we add a class called run to it. So imagine that this dot is going to start by just existing as a small dot with some transparency. Then we're going to add a class called run to it. And this class is going to trigger a change of styles. And we are going to do that smoothly. So we're going to use CSS transitions for it. And this run class is going to turn this small dot into a very big circle and make it fully transparent. So let's do that. First, of course, the opacity is going to be 0 at this point, like it's supposed to be completely transparent. I am going to use transform scale to increase, but first, let me address a common issue that many of you may have, which is trying to use width to increase it. So let's set the width and the height to 200 pixels. And let me get rid of this transform here because that was just for us to be able to see the button. So what is the problem with doing this? Let me also increase it here to 10, just so that we can see it. Okay, of course I'm gonna get it back to 1 pixel of width and height afterwards, but I just want us to be able to see the button, to see the circle. Let me inspect this element. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add the class run to it. First, as you can see, it's taking a lot more space and it's completely transparent at this point. So just so that we can see it, I'm gonna put 10% of opacity just so that we can actually see the circle. Okay, so what are the problems that we have here? First, as the repo wave grows, it's actually taking up space in the container element, and it shouldn't. Like, I get that the text of the button takes space in the bottom, but the wave shouldn't like push the text and push the other elements that are inside the bottom. It should almost seem like it's in a different flow. Like it should be disconnected from the positioning of the other elements. How can that be done? That can be done by using position absolute. This is going to take this element outside of the regular flow of the elements in the DOM, and it's going to put it in its own space, kind of. But when we use position absolute, This also gives us the ability to use top, left, right, and bottom to position our element precisely where we want it to be, which is going to be extremely important when we start using JavaScript to calculate the exact place where the user clicked on the button so that we can put the circle there. So with this, I can actually do like top 20%, 20 pixel, and left 10 pixels. And then what this is going to do is it's going to place the circle exactly at 20 pixels from the top and 10 pixels from the left. But now we have a different problem. This problem now is that our circle is being positioned 20 pixels from the top and 10 pixels from the left based on the entire page, and that's not what we want. We want it to be 20 pixels from the top of the bottom and 10 pixels from the left of the bottom. So what we want to do is we want to say that this element should be positioned in relation to the bottom. How can we do that? In CSS, when we set position absolute, what this does is the element is going to ask its parent if it can calculate its position based on the parent. And the parent is either going to say yes or no. If the parent says yes, then our element is going to position itself based on that parent element. If the parent says no, then our element is going to ask to the other parent and to the other and to the other until it reaches the last element, which is the body. So what's going on here is that every single parent is saying, no, I don't want you to position yourself based on me. So it's getting into the point where it asks that question to the body element, and then the body says, yeah, sure, like position based on me. We need to make the bottom say yes to this question. How can we do that? We can first select the bottom. So I'm doing this by selecting every single element that has the repo attribute. So this makes sure that I don't select the element that doesn't have the repo. In fact, it only selects the elements that have the repo attribute. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say that the position of this element should be relative. Done. Now, when I say 20 pixels from the top, it's 20 pixels from the top of the bottom. When I say 10 pixels from the left, it's 10 pixels from the left of the bottom. How can I prove that? If I get rid of the run class, you can see there are 20 pixels here from the top and 10 pixels here from the left. Let me increase the dev tools and show this to you in practice, like here. See? If I put 0 pixels from the top, it's actually touching the top of the bottom. If I put 0 pixels from the left, it's actually touching the left side of the bottom. I was actually going to explain a different problem and then I got into this one, sorry. But the other situation that I was going to explain earlier is the usage of height and width to increase the size of the element. Does it work if we use height and width to increase the size of the wave? Yes, it does. As you could see, like if I just add the class run, it does increase. And if I just add a transition to it, then it's going to do that really beautifully. So let me do this here so that you can see. Transition like in 1 second, all properties using like ease out, for example. Now, boom, like we have this very nice, very beautiful transition. The problem is, and you're probably not going to notice here because I'm using a very fast computer, and this is also like just one very small element, so you're not going to notice this, but there is a performance issue here. It would be much faster if instead of increasing the width and the height, if we instead just used transform scale to scale the size of the element. The reason for that is that width and height, by default, they push every single other element. So they make the browser recalculate the position of all the other elements that are in the same flow of that element. Of course, that now that we are putting our wave in a different flow by using position absolute, then the browser won't have to recalculate everything, but the browser will still be obliged to check if it should or not recalculate everything, which is an extra computation that we can't avoid if we just use transform scale. Let me show it to you. I'm going to remove top and left because we don't need that anymore. I was just showing the fact. I'm going to get back to 1 pixel of width and height. And instead of increasing the width, I am going to use transform. It's below. I'm going to use transform scale, and I'm going to scale it by like 200 times. And also add the transition that we did before. So I'm going to transition all properties in 1 second using the ease out timing function. I will explain that in a second, just so that I don't forget to explain this. Okay, so now if I select, let me actually get back to the top 20 pixels and the left 10 pixels, just so that we can actually see it in a better position. Okay, so our dot is here. When I add the class run, we can see the transition. What's cool now is that we are being more performant because we're using transform scale instead of increasing the width and the height. But let me show you something really interesting. If I removed position absolute and I use transform scale, it's not pushing the other elements as it was before. Like here, remember before we weren't using transform scale, we were using width and height to increase the size of the element. And if I do this, if I use width and height, then it pushes the other elements. But if instead I used transform scale, then it doesn't. Even if I don't use position absolute, it still just grows without pushing the other elements. That's because when you use transform to make changes to your element, the browser just recalculates the position and the things that changed in that particular element. It doesn't recalculate the position of everything else. So this is why transform is much more performant than making changes to width and height. So let me just remove that, get back to our position absolute. Why have I chosen to use ease out as the timing function here? The reason for that is that ease out, the curve ease out, you can see it here, it starts in full speed and then it decelerates, which is exactly what you would expect if you had a bunch of water centralized in a single place and then you would just let it spill all over. It would start very fast and then decelerate. Okay, so you wouldn't expect, if you were to do this, you wouldn't expect it to like start getting speed, accelerate, and then decelerate. So this is why I'm not using ease or ease in out, because ease in out or ease, they would slowly accelerate and then decelerate. I don't want that. I want ease out so that it starts with full speed and then it decelerates. Exactly like it would be if you were an explosion, which is exactly what we're doing here. It's an explosion. It starts fast, then it decelerates. Also, if you want to learn more about CSS transitions and all the other ways in which you can do transitions and animations, even using advanced JavaScript animations, then I have an entire course about web animations. Of course, you don't need to watch that course to understand what we're doing here with this particular effect using creating this ripple effect with material design, but it will give you a much more complete understanding of web animations. So in this video, I'm teaching you how to code the ripple effect, but if you do my course, you will be able to code any animation, any transition that you want, which is what you would expect from a professional. So I highly recommend, if you want to get better in your web animation skills, or if you use that for work reasons, I highly recommend checking my course. It's available on lucaspaganini.com/webanimations. By the time I am recording this video, my course is not yet launched, but I do have an open waiting list. And if you join the waiting list now, you will guarantee a huge huge discount when the course launches. So if you are at all interested in web animations, then I highly recommend going to that link and joining the waiting list so that you can get a huge discount when the course launches. And you're not losing anything for that. Like, come on, even if you don't buy the course, why not guarantee the discount? Back to the video. Let me remove this comment since I already explained why I decided to use ease out. And now we actually need to do the part where we use JavaScript to calculate the precise location where we clicked. Okay, so let's do that. So let's go into the JavaScript. And well, the first thing that I'm gonna have to do here is, of course, I'm gonna have to get all the elements that have the repo attribute. So I'm gonna use document query selector all, and I will use this media query to select every single element that has the repo attribute. Now I am going to loop each one of those elements. Moment with repo. And while I am looping, I am going to run a function which, let me close this here because I need space. Okay. For each element that has the repo attribute, I will add an event listener. I will be listening for click events that happen in this element. And whenever a click event happens, by the way, I will change this in just a few minutes. Like, I won't be using the click event. I will use another event, but let's start with click first because I think this is what most people would do. And I want to explain what would be the problem if you went that route. Okay, so I'm going to use the click event and I will create the element. So here I want to create a repo element. So this will be like a div with the class repo. So I'm just adding a comment so that you know exactly what this line of code is supposed to do. So repo element is going to be equal to document create element, create a div, and then I will access the class list and add the class repo to that div. Now I need to position the repo. To do that, I will have to get the event that is being passed to this callback function. So this triggers a mouse event. And from a mouse event, I can get the X and Y positions. So a mouse event has a property called offset X. Offset X is the amount of pixels from the left of the element where the click happened. For example, if I click on this button here in this particular position, then offset X will be the distance in pixels from the left of the button to where I clicked. So it's always based on the button that received the click. If I click here, then the offset X will be the distance between here and the left side of the page. So it's always based on the element that received the click, which is exactly what we want. We could also get the distance between the left side of the page instead of the left side of the element that received the click, but that's not what we want. So instead, we are going to use offset X so that we get the distance from the element that received the click, not from the entire page. Const Y is going to be the same thing. So mouse event offset Y. Now we have the positions from where the user clicked. And now the next thing that we need to do is we need to position the repo element according to that. So I'm going to access the style of this element, and then I'm going to set the left property to be X pixels. So this is a template literal expression. This is the same thing as doing like x concatenated with pixel, but I just find that it's easier to read strings if I use this syntax here instead of using plus for string concatenation. So we're going to do that to position the element from the left side of the element that received the click, which is going to be the bottom. Now we're going to do the same thing for the top. So the top is going to use the y const. So y gives us the distance between the top of the element. So we're going to set the top property in our repo with this amount of pixels. So why am I adding the string px? It's because I'm just going to get the actual number. So even though it is 10 pixels, I'm only going to get the number 10. I'm not going to get 10 px. So I need to turn that into 10 px so that I can actually use it as a style as a property for the top and left, as a value for the top and left CSS properties of the repo element. Oh, so much information, I'm getting lost here. Okay, if we try it out, like if I click here, nothing is happening. The reason for that is we are creating the element, we are positioning it correctly, but we are not appending this element to the DOM. Our element needs to be placed inside the bottom with the repo attribute, just like we did here statically. So I'm going to remove this one which we did statically because now we're going to do this dynamically. We will have to get the element with repo attribute and append the repo element to it. I actually think it's append child. Okay, let's see if that works. Oh, here, the circle is appearing. Oh, here, can you see it? Like, whenever I click, this small circle appears. So this is working. Okay, that's cool, this is working. Let me save this. Good. Now, what we need to do is, of course, we have to add the class run, so it triggers the transition and turns this small dot into a big circle and makes it transparent. So let's do that. Repo out class list and run. But now if I click, there's no transition. It just turns into this gigantic circle immediately. So that's a problem. Why is that happening? This is happening because every one of those things, even though we are like appending the element before adding the class run, they are happening so fast that the browser doesn't do one and then repaints and do the other. It does everything so fast that when the browser actually renders the content of the page, the repo element already has the class run. So if it never started without the class run, then there wasn't a reason to start by being a small dot and grow into a big circle. It already starts by being a gigantic circle. This is a problem. We need it to be rendered as a dot and then to trigger the transition that turns it into a transparent big circle. One way of doing it, and this is not a recommended way, I will show a better way in a second, is using set timeout. So for example, we could say like wait 50 milliseconds, and then after 50 milliseconds, then you add the class run. And this, the position of the arguments is wrong. Like the duration needs to come afterwards. First, we pass the callback function. Okay, now this is working now, and it does seems like a good solution, but this is actually not declarative because we don't want to wait 50 milliseconds to add the class. What we actually need is a way to tell the browser to only add the run class after it had already rendered the initial element without the class run. And we are doing that by waiting 50 milliseconds, but 50 milliseconds is like a magical number. So let's say that your computer is refreshing every 10 times per second, so that would be 10 hertz. First, that's a pretty bad monitor, but that's a different problem. So if you have a monitor that refreshes every like 10 times per second, then you have 10 hertz. And what that means is that every 100 milliseconds, the browser is going to refresh. So if you had a monitor that bad, then our code would not work. Why? Because we're only waiting 50 milliseconds. So even though we're waiting 50 milliseconds, this class will be added to the element before the browser renders for the first time. So it wouldn't work, the transition wouldn't trigger. So you always have to like make those calculations and do something like that, which is not what we want. What we actually want is to just tell the browser, hey browser, like render this element, and then before you do your next rendering, before you paint the screen again, then you add the class run. And we can do that. We can do that in a much better performant and declarative way by using request animation frame, which is what we're going to do here. So request animation frame takes a callback function that will be run in the next animation frame. So in the next animation frame, then we're going to add the class run. And it still works just like before, but now we have a much more declarative, much more performant solution that doesn't rely on magical numbers. Now, the last thing we want to do is we want to remove the element when the transition is done. Remove the repo element when the transition is done. To do that, it's actually quite simple. Just like we have the click event, which triggers whenever the element is clicked, we also have another event called transition end, which triggers when a transition on the element is done. So we can just use that event, listen to it, and when it happens, we remove the element from the DOM. So let's do that. We are going to listen, we're going to add an event listener, and the event is going to be the transition end. And whenever this event happens, we will remove our element. Oh, sorry. I should not do this with the element with repo. I need to do this with the repo element. Okay, so now, boom. When the transition is done, the element is removed from the DOM. Pretty cool. Another thing is that our circle is not completely transparent at the end, and then you can actually see the element being removed. So to change that, let's go back to the CSS and make sure that our repo effect, our repo element has 0 opacity when it is like this in its last state. So now, much smoother. Look at this, so beautiful. Another problem is that our repo effect is not contained inside our bottom element, so let's take care of this now. To do this, we only need to add overflow hidden. What this does is it's telling our browser that anything that overflows from within our element should be hidden. So now our repo effect is contained inside the bottom. Now let's talk about why I did not want it to use a click event and what should be the best approach here. I didn't want it to use a click event because here I am clicking, I'm clicking, but you can't see it. Like, you can only see the animation when I let it go. So click, nothing happens, let it go, then you can see it. That's not really the effect that we want, right? The effect that we want is for the wave to happen as soon as I click, not when I release. So to do that, you could use mouse down instead of click. Now, when I click, it happens. It's not when I release, it's when I put the mouse down, which is exactly what we wanted. So now it's working properly, but there's still another problem, which is mouse down gives the impression that we should only listen to when a mouse is pushed downwards, which is not really the thing anymore because we're in 2023 or whenever you're watching this video. So we have a lot of other devices too. For example, if you're in a touch screen, then that means that it's not a mouse. So if you just touch, then it shouldn't trigger because it's your finger, it's not a mouse. Also, what if you're using like a pen and you have like a monitor that you can touch on it? So how should that work? Actually, using mouse down already deals with all that. So even if you just touch, it still triggers the mouse down event. But semantically, there is a better event that declares our intentions more clearly, which is pointer down. Pointer down is a more abstract thing. So it's not a mouse. A mouse, you would think like it's an actual mouse, but pointer can be anything that pressed the element. So it can be your finger in a touch screen, it can be a touch pen, it can be a mouse, it can be any other kinds of peripherals that we create in the future. So maybe in the future we'll be using virtual reality and you're just gonna blink and this is gonna be you pressing the element somehow, and pointer down already takes care of that. So this is why we're using pointer down. Functionally, same thing as mouse down, but semantically it gives a better description. And as you can see, it works exactly the same way. Now, have you noticed this? That was pretty fast, so I don't know if you noticed, but oh, can you see it? Like some of the ripple effects are coming in from the top left corner. Why the hell is that happening? That is happening because we calculate the X and Y positions based on the element that received the click. And then you might say, yeah, but if I'm clicking here, then it should be in the top and left based on the bottom, right? No, because if you click too fast, then you're not clicking on the bottom. You're clicking on the ripple effect. If you click too fast, then you're clicking on the center of the ripple effect, which has a top 0 and a left 0. And if you place it in the top 0 and left 0, then it comes here. So this is a problem. We need to somehow tell the browser that any clicks that we make to the ripple effect should be ignored. And the browser should treat it as if we had clicked the element that is behind it, which is the bottom. How can we do that? That seems complex, but it's actually extremely easy. You can do that using the pointer events property in CSS and setting it to none. So by doing that, any pointer event that happens in our ripple effect will be ignored. And the browser will instead look for the element that was behind it to position the click. So now I can click how many times I want and it works properly. I believe this is all. We can also have a very, very small performance improvement here by saying that the transform property will change so that the browser can be prepared to make changes to the element based on the transform property. It's not a big performance improvement, to be honest, but it's a nice one. There's nothing to lose from doing that, so let's do it. And yeah, that's actually everything. So I think I covered everything that we had here. It's also nice to note that any elements that you create with the ripple attribute will have the ripple effect. So that means that we're not constrained to using the ripple effect only with buttons. For example, if I were to create a div saying this is a regular text. Okay, so here is our div. This is a regular text. But now if I add the ripple attribute to this div, then, oh, now our div has the ripple effect when we click on it. Pretty cool. So this is extremely declarative. You can just reuse that however you want. that was it for today's video. Again, I will be leaving the link to this CodePen in the video description. If you have any questions, you can leave them in the comments. If you like that kind of content, then please consider subscribing to the channel. I also post a lot of content about Angular and web development in general on my other social media platforms, such as on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn. So you can also follow me there if you're interested in that. And again, if you want to learn even more about web animations in depth and have a very strong foundation of it, not just like knowing how to do a few animations, but actually understanding how web animations work and being able to create any web animations from scratch, then please consider checking out my course on lucaspaganini.com/web animations. Also, I am the CEO of Envoid, which is a software development company which works for any company in the world by working remotely. So if by any chances your company is looking for excellent web developers to help you in your project, then please consider contacting us at envoid.com. That was all for today. Thank you, have a great day, and I will see you in the next one.